Good morning, students. This is our last installment of our video lectures for this unit. We're going to talk about the emergence of the political machine, and this has to do with how cities were run during the industrialization period. So today we're going to focus on, in particular, local and national political corruption in the 19th century, and this leads to calls for reform. We'll largely start to look at the reforms in more depth in the next unit with progressivism. So you can go ahead and hit pause and take a look at the vocabulary. Again, everything will not be, word for word on your guide, but you need to read each one closely and find the best fit for each. So hit pause and do your vocabulary on this slide. All right, so background. Political machines. So as you learned in the last module, cities were in terrible shape due to rapid growth, and local and city governments were inefficient or inexperienced. We have never had this kind of growth of cities. So anticipating the problems and how to deal with the problems didn't come quickly. So this opened the door for a new structure, which were political machines. They offered services to voters and businesses in exchange for political or financial support. So what is a political machine? And this question is directly on your guide. This is a group that ran the city government. The city government were run by political bosses. Sometimes they're called party bosses. So they are largely affiliated with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Either the boss or a small group told the workers and the supporters of the machines what to do. In exchange for support and votes, the political machines provided jobs and services, particularly to immigrants and to poor working class persons. So, what is a political machine? It's a group that ran city government. And in exchange for support and votes, the political machines provided jobs and services to the immigrants and the poor. So how was the political machine structured? So basically, at the top, you have your city bosses, and this is indicated by C on your chart. They controlled municipal jobs, so the police, the fire, sanitation. They controlled businesses and licenses and inspections. So if you needed a license for your business, you went to the city boss. They were the ones that allocated those. They had influence in courts, and they gave money to schools and hospitals. And then in the middle, you had the ward bosses. This is indicated by a letter A on your guide. And they secured votes in precincts. They provided jobs, contracts, and local appointments. And then they did favors and provided services for votes. And lastly, you have the local precinct workers and captains, which is indicated by, I can't do B very well on this one. And let me see. I'll just write it down here. B. They gained voter support within the city block or the neighborhood, and then they reported to the ward boss. So the precinct workers reported to the ward boss, and the ward boss reported to the city boss. So it was a pyramid hierarchical structure for the political machine in the city. So how did political machines obtain power? How did they gain their power? Well, political bosses could dominate city politics pretty easily, and if they did that, they became very powerful. So they did this by supporting immigrants, supporting workers, and then they in turn would support the political boss, okay? And they used a system called patronage, which meant that they could hand out government jobs to supporters as rewards, even if the person that they were giving the job to wasn't qualified or a good person to do the job. They rewarded the supporters with jobs. And then they were able to control City Hall and make profits on city contracts or by collecting bribes. So they became powerful if they are able to dominate city politics through getting elected. And then they used patronage. So if you supported them, they gave you your job. And these were nice jobs. These were civil service jobs. So civil service are government agency jobs, like jobs that you give out licenses to businesses. that you help to, plan construction, and then you hire construction workers. So again, they controlled City Hall, and they profited from the city contracts, which we'll talk about in a few moments here too. So, what did they accomplish? So, what was good about them? So, they helped really to combat the problems of urbanization. So, this is one thing that they did that was good. So, they made improvements to cities where cities weren't really equipped to do this yet. So, they started paving streets, they did new construction, they built water pipes and plumbing. So, these were things that helped to improve some of those issues we talked about in the last section with urbanization. So, why did immigrants support the bosses? So many bosses were immigrants themselves. They spoke the language of the immigrants. They made them feel welcome when they came here. They understood their concerns and problems, and they helped the immigrants find places to live and got them jobs. And in return, the immigrants provided them with what they needed to keep power, which was votes. So, how were they corrupt? So, they were corrupt in a few different ways. So, one way in which they were corrupt is by graft. The graft is something that allowed them to feed their greed and corruption. So a graft is an illegal use of political influence for personal gain. A graft could be having inside information on a lucrative business deal, and then therefore you're able to get in on that business deal and get money for it. It doesn't have to be a monetary personal gain. It can be another type of gain like status, or using your political influence to maybe blackmail people in order to gain money or influence. So a graft is any type of illegal use of political influence. Another way in which they used illegal ways was to win elections. So they filled a list of eligible voters with names of dogs, children, or people who had already died. And then they used those names to cast as many votes as were necessary to win. So first you have the use of graft, which is an illegal use of political influence for personal gain. And then they won elections in many ways illegally by putting names on of non-existing voters and then casting votes in their name. So another way in which they benefited, but it was corrupt, was through the kickback. So after hiring a person to work on a city construction project, a machine could ask the worker to turn in a bill that was higher than the actual cost of the work. So then the workers then gave that money, that actual, higher than actual cost, back to the machine. So that was called a kickback. So, let's say that they provided a service that cost, $100, but the bill would say that it cost $200. Then the extra $100 would go back to the political machine. So they would profit from it. Okay, whoops, I got to go back. Hang on. All right. So that was another way in which they benefited. So also through bribes. So another way that they did this was by doing favors for businesses in return for cash. So they would accept bribes to allow illegal activities such as gambling. And then also, the police would rarely interfere with these illegal activities because the bosses often controlled the police. So they would take bribes, for favors, or they would do it to say, "Well, look the other way. You can gamble, you can be illegal, but we'll go ahead and we will, just say, we don't see it." William Marcy Tweed was one of the most powerful political bosses in New York City. He became the head of Tammany Hall, which was New York City's most powerful Democratic political machine. And the Tweed Ring was a group of corrupt politicians that were led by Boss Tweed. They took in as much as $200 million from kickbacks and bribes between 1869 and 1871. So again, he's the most powerful political boss. He's the head of Tammany Hall, which was a political machine in New York City. And the Tweed Ring was a group of corrupt politicians that he led. And again, they took a lot of money in kickbacks and bribes. So Thomas Nast was actually a political cartoonist, and he made fun of Tweed in these various newspapers. And his cartoons brought attention to the corruption at the hands of Tweed. So eventually, the public grew outraged by Tweed's corrupt practices, and authorities wound up breaking up the Tweed Ring in 1871. And Tweed and many of his followers were convicted of various crimes and sentenced to prison. So, what we'll see in our next unit is the progressive system, and there will be reforms to city politics that make them less corrupt. So, several presidents of the US worked to reform the patronage system. This was the giving out of jobs, civil service jobs, to people who were not qualified. In our next unit, we'll examine how progressives replaced bosses and machines with public-minded mayors. They expanded city services so political machines didn't have to provide them. And they did this to help deal with things like overcrowding, fire hazards, and lack of public services. And then cities took direct ownership of utilities such as gas, water, and electricity. And then new forms of government were introduced to discourage corruption. So now you're going to complete two ed puzzles. One is on Boss Tweed and Thomas Nast. So you'll see in that particular ed puzzle video and in the guide some of the big ideas about Boss Tweed and political machines and corruption. And you'll see images that Thomas Nast drew, and you'll be able to see evidence of Boss Tweed and his corruption in those images. And it gives a little bit more of an in-depth look at the corruption and how it was dealt with and how Thomas Nast's work brought attention to it. Then the second one is an ed puzzle, Boss Tweed. It's a funny way, I think, to remember what Boss Tweed did, and I think you'll find it fun, but there's also a guide for that. All right, so when you're done with this video, go ahead and hit stop and go ahead and move on to the ed puzzles.